I have the huge honor, and I am so excited to have Kate Sanchez with me today. Welcome, Kate.
Hi, I'm really excited to be here. I've been watching your podcast for a while, so I'm really excited to be on one.
It's so cool, and it's a kind of preview of the Latinx Pop Lab popcasts that are going to be. It's going to be right around the corner, and we're going to be doing a lot of really cool stuff in Austin together. I can't wait.
I'm really excited. There has been a lack of cool things in Austin for a while, so I'm excited for this to come.
Yes, well, you're one of the big reasons why I'm moving to Austin. So, but let's talk about you. Kate, how in the world did you get into pop culture studies? What's your superhero origin story, Kate?
I'm a big old nerd. Honestly, is like the easiest way to answer that because when I was an undergraduate at UT, I jumped majors. So I came in as a classical archaeology major, jumped to a government major, and then ended up in religious studies and Middle Eastern studies as a double major. And it was there that when I took my first religious studies class, and we were studying Emile Durkheim, whose entire thing is functional religion. So religion performs as a function for those who use it. I took a class with Tom Tweed. I don't know where he is now, but he's pretty renowned in Catholic studies. And he had a section of his class that focused on looking at pilgrimage, not just from the traditional religious sense, but pilgrimage as in what people do when they go to a football game or what they do when they go to, like, essentially the popular aspects of it. And then I got to read a book called Religious Fakes, I believe, by David Chittister. And it was a book that looked at the way in which we construct religion around everyday things, including pop culture. And so for me, as a young undergrad, I was like, oh, this is really cool. What if I did this, but I looked at fandom? So my undergraduate thesis was actually on fandom as religion. And I looked at Star Wars, Star Trek, and then the convention as ritual. So Star Wars and Star Trek both have their own religions literally built in that people practice tied to it. So like there is a whole bunch of, not a whole bunch, but there are people who see Jediism as a type of religion that runs parallel to their own, and they strongly embrace it, as much as people think that it's a joke. And then on the Star Trek side, the Vulcan philosophy is embedded in how a lot of people process and how fans process. And so I looked at those, and it was kind of natural for me to just take my passion and go into a space that I could see it as something else. Because for me, especially growing up in an extremely religious household that I didn't necessarily feel connected to, because I'm an atheist personally, and it's been a long journey to be able to say that. Pop culture was my grounding force. It was the way that I connected to people. It was a way that I connected people who weren't like me. It was a way that I could find a home. And so it's always mattered. And it's always been something more than just that TV show or just that movie or just that comic. And then when I went into graduate school at the PhD level, I entered with a dissertation, first a master's project that would then turn into a dissertation project, focusing on how we construct identities for people through our pop culture. So my main study was looking at comic books. I read about over 300 comic books, all of which represented Muslims in a quote unquote positive light. That doesn't mean it wasn't stereotypical, but there had been research done on how we perceive Muslims as the other and as villains. And so my focus was to see, okay, but what happens when we actually have representations in the big two? So I only looked at Marvel and DC as heroes. And I used a lot of this because I fell in love with Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel. And I wanted to kind of track the history of Muslims in comics and how we got to her, and specifically how we see Americans. So that was my main focus. Fun fact, I speak Arabic better than I speak Spanish, and I understand Urdu better than I understand Spanish. So, and that's because of my work that I did, kind of like blending Middle Eastern studies and Islamic studies with religious studies and pop culture. That was a long origin story.
I love
TLDR,
that origin story.
I'm a nerd.
That is awesome. And I also love your fun facts there. That's like, so like your superpower is like, I love it. It's unexpected and super powerful. Latinx pop cultural creatives, yesterday and today, kind of getting at like, okay, so you're moving, so you're in this space that you've kind of built and that was there, but you're building and growing and you in different ways, this community of kind of pop cultural peoples. You were doing your fandom work, but then you kind of moving that into the direction of, comics and everything. Arabic, Muslims. What about Latinx pop culture and creatives? And where, like, are there any kind of like, I don't know, eye-opening moments for you in that space?
Yeah. So my work now, because I've left academia behind me, which I get really sad about sometimes, but then I remember, I'm actually doing some good work, so I don't get sad anymore. But as the EIC of a site focused on highlighting pop culture, the moment for me didn't necessarily have to do with the media I was looking at, but it had to do the makeup of a car. So hold on. How do I explain this? My big, oh, wow, this is going to be my focus moment when it came to being a critic, because I'm a Rotten Tomatoes critic. I cover film festivals. I got the amazing opportunity to be on the red carpet at South by Southwest in 2019, specifically for The Curse of La Llorona, which was a film that I was already rolling my eyes at immediately when I saw the trailer. But I wanted to go and open because I had the chance to speak with the creative. So the creatives, the writers, director, and some of the cast, two of which are Latinx. And I wanted to ask them, and I asked every single one of them the same question, like, how do you think this authentically represents folklore that is so important and so ingrained to so many Latinx folks, specifically here in Texas? Like, La Llorona is around every dang corner, because I'm originally from San Antonio, which is a 70% Latinx city. And I realized by the second time I asked the question to somebody that I was the only one on the carpet asking those questions. The guy next to me, who is actually from an outlet that is, I don't want to call the outlet out, but it's specifically for marginalized folks, for people of color. He asked them what their favorite pizza topping was. He asked them what they were enjoying about Austin. What do they want folks to see in the movie? And the other person on my other side, who is a white woman, and everybody else, there were like maybe 3 spots of color on that carpet. And everybody within earshot, like nobody was actually investigating it. And it was that moment where I realized, like, I'm actually in a really unique position where my hard work has paid off. I can get these spots to ask these questions. And not only that, it's hard being angry all the time. And it takes a lot of work to have these difficult conversations with creatives. Why don't I make it my mission to highlight the stuff that I love and uplift it as much as I can? So that was really the moment where it's not that like I didn't want to focus on my Latinidad. It was more that like academically, I felt that people would see me as less than. But this is a really like baggage that I carried with me when I went into academia, is like, I didn't want to be seen as the person doing this because they should. I didn't want to be the Latina who is doing Latina studies because I was Latina. And I didn't want that I wanted people to take me seriously. And coming out of academia didn't help that. And moving into pop culture in a journalistic sense, I realized that my Latinidad, my experiences, my identity that was what was going to make people see me seriously, because there needed to be somebody talking about this. And I wanted to be that person. And I wanted to make sure I was uplifting the other people out there who were doing that work. So for me today, anytime there's any bit of Latinx content that comes out on Netflix or anything like that, I'm signed up to review. I am there to praise it as much as I can. I think like the one moment where I think there were two pieces of media that hit me in very different ways. And Sesmanos is one of them, because it blended religion and folkloric religion and gave representations of curanderas that I'd never seen before. And I wrote like 6 pieces on it because I just wanted people to watch this piece. And then another one that really hit home was Gentified, because that felt like home. It was the first time that I saw like Latinx folks just living. There wasn't a grand story to it. There wasn't, they weren't being forced to do things. Like it was just life. And it reminded me of life in San Antonio, which as much as I love Austin, I like life in San Antonio, being surrounded by people like me in a space that we've cultivated for ourselves is very different. And so like those were 2 things that I pushed really hard on social media and in reviews and stuff like that. I feel like I've lost the question, but I feel like I've also answered it.
You've more than answered it. I love everything. And also, the really like one of the takeaways is that it, having you on the red carpet, asking questions that elevate by showing the complexity of us and our culture and how it's being recreated, right? In the popular spaces. So La Llorona and not pizza. I mean, of course. I love it. It's so cool. I'm so glad that I'm on your team, Kate. But so tell me, but why though a geek community? Tell us a little bit about why, but why though?
But Why Though a Geek Community is a passion project that me and my husband started that has evolved into so much more. It started as a podcast that I started when I was deciding to leave academia. It was one of those things where I knew I was starting to feel like I didn't want to be there, but there were elements of academia that I still loved. I loved teaching. I loved researching and talking. And we started our flagship podcast called But Why Though the Podcast. And we talk about why pop culture matters in a different sense every single week. So like this week, we're talking about Monster Hunter and Hunter x Hunter, which are 2 a game and an anime. And last week we talked about Tom and Jerry, and we've talked about we've talked about football and the NBA, and like we cover every piece about culture and dive into it more. And then in 2018, my husband and I were kind of sitting there, and I was realizing that like I was missing writing because I left academia in 2017, end of 2017. And by then we had built up a nice community around our podcast, had a fairly decent Twitter presence. And I told him, I was just like, Matt, I miss writing. Like I miss actually doing something. I see people getting screenings to things and getting to do interviews and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, I wonder if we could do that. And my husband, being the person that he is, was like, please don't take this all on yourself. What if we build it into, a site? What if we try to do that? And we put out a call for writers, and we immediately had folks, raise their hand and jump in. And it was their first time writing. And our site really works as a place for people who love writing and want to share their thoughts and opinions, but may not necessarily have that like super, super deep experience, but they're getting it. And as we began to grow, we put, I don't want to say diversity first, because it just sounds weird, but like we put people first, we put community first, and we wanted to make sure that we were a community that didn't just have a whole different opinions, but made sure that people felt at home and made sure that they felt that their opinions had the same value as the person next to them. We do whatever we can to uplift and market every single piece of content on our site, whether it is a review or a think piece. And for us, that's important because we want to be a home, and we are a platform for marginalized folks to come and speak on issues that they may not get the opportunity for in other spaces. I mean, I have the privilege to work in film, gaming, and anime, but with that privilege of being in those spaces and being in those rooms, I also very much understand that there aren't many other brown women in those spaces either. Or if there are, it's like, oh, there's one spot, and that one spot went to me, and I'm filled with a room of white dudes. And it's like that across the board. But for us, we want it to not be like that. So we've really focused on just being a home. We're a site and we're a business, but we're a community first. And that's something that like we've never lost sight of, and we don't want to lose sight of. And it's one thing that I'm also really thankful for. So yeah, I don't know if that answered.
No, that's great, Kate. And you being in this, being kind of creative director, founder, and writer and critic and podcaster and all the things you do. Gosh, I mean, what a great role model. I mean, imagine your younger self coming across you. It might have saved you a bunch of headaches, right?
I'm not gonna lie, I've been having this struggle. Like last year, Austin Women featured me. Like they wrote a feature on me about the work I was doing, and it was one of those moments where it was validating, but I was also like, oh gosh, what? But it like, I'm really thankful you said that, because when I started academia, I wanted to be a professor because I didn't see people who looked like me being a professor. Like there was none of that authority. Like my department had no women of color in it at all, and had one man of color. And so like I wanted to be that person. And so I was worried when I moved into this space that I wouldn't be able to have that same impact. So just from a standpoint, thank you for saying that. And no, like you are right. Like I made a Facebook post the other day, and it's kind of like, especially because it's National or International Women's Month, like I want to leave the world better for other brown women the same way that like Dolores Huerta and like all these like women before me did. Obviously my work is not as impactful as Dolores Huerta, but like, all the women who have like paved the way in male dominated spaces and really pushed for our voices to be heard.
Well, it's like you said, it's working together, right? So your work does a certain kind of clearing of room within this larger space, and others are doing other work, but it's all about working together to make that happen. And boy, you on the red carpet, you with all of this creative, like smart, critical, intellectual work, your interests as varied and kind of beautiful as they are. I mean, anime, Arabic, Muslims, La Llorona. Anyway, it brings me to my next question, which is, wow, I mean, what's your sense of this crazy industry that's like, most people are just like kind of habituated to, like they don't even realize how gendered and racialized and sexualized it is. I mean, this billboard with Tecate as a, finally a cold Latina, right? And people probably just drive by it and don't think twice. But what, from your side, your perspective, your experience, how are you seeing this industry, this pop culture industry?
It's hard. It's hard, man. And it happens a lot. Like there are me as a person in the industry and me critiquing what I see in the industry. And there are some times where like I see something pop up and I have to pick whether I have the energy to review it or make a comment, because it gets real hard. Like there is, when we talk about like the way that Latinas specifically are sexualized in this industry, it means that when I have characters to look to, most of the time they look a very certain way. They all look like Sofia Vergara, which is great because Sofia Vergara is a beautiful woman, and like sexuality is not something that we should be shunning. But at the same time, if the only time you represent us is as that, then we have a problem, especially when it comes to a category of women, for whether it's Latinas or Afro-Latinas or Black women, we don't get the chance to be calm. We don't get the chance to be non-sexualized. We don't get the chance to be, the tech person in the room. And one of my favorite examples of this is there's a game called Apex Legends. It is a battle royale game, really cool, amazing diversity, and it had it right off the bat. Made it its goal to not really have sexualized characters, or, their women were multiple things. And then in comes Loba. She is the first Latina in the game. Her hips are wider than anything else. She's extremely sexualized, and she uses her legs a lot. And it hit me because why did they go out of the way to showcase women, specifically in this game, in non-sexualized ways, and then they make a Latina, and that's what they do. And a lot of where I have to put my energy is finding what spaces I can lend voice to and speak to, especially in media that I talk about. I've talked a little bit about Loba online, but then you hit this weirder space where you kind of feel this pressure to speak on everything, because the everything is not a lot. When it comes to actual Latinx representation and things, we're not there a lot of the time. There are very few games, like in the video game space, very few games that you can even name a Latinx protagonist. And even less that you can name a Latinx protagonist that is actually voiced by a Latinx person. And that's a problem. And it's hard because when we speak about growing diversity in areas, a lot of the times Latinx really aren't at the table or thought of. And it gets frustrating. And then it gets even more frustrating when you see shows get canceled continually. Because in the TV space, there is not a Latinx focused network programmed TV show. There isn't. When you look at television, movies, 3%, that's still our number. When you look at the number of creatives on signed with Netflix, yeah, I don't remember the exact statistic, but it's single digits and it's below 5%.
Yeah.
And that just came out from
I think it's 4%. Yeah.
4%. Yeah. And as a community in the US, we make up, we're about 20 million people. We're the largest minority community. And not only that, for me, when I think about Latinidad and representations of it, I think of something like Gentified, because it showcased that there are looking Latinx isn't a thing. There are so many different cultures and races within our community that if you just give us the spotlight, you can check all your other diversity check boxes, because I know that's what you're worried about, Hollywood. And it's frustrating because in this industry and in the pop culture industry, so much of everything that I get the chance to review, it's hard because I don't know, do I look at this from where I'm at?
Yeah.
Am I thankful that they gave me these scraps, or do I push for more? Yeah. And then online, you get two camps. I mean, well, three camps. You get the person that complains that you use Latinx in your tweet and misses your entire point. And then you have the person who says, stop bringing us down, which is what happened when I released my review of the Selena series, because it was not good. And Selena, I have every single piece of the Selena makeup line. She's my icon. And then you have the people, which I fall into, where it's we can't accept the scraps. We have to push for more. We can say it is great to have this on here, but we can't just say, go watch it to drive it, because then we keep getting bad representations of who we are. And if we don't speak up, we're not in that space. And outside of that, so that's the media itself and engaging with the media. Me engaging with PR and other people, I have to constantly police how I talk. I have to constantly police the emails I send, because of what happens when you are a Latina. Like, I am both excited and scared when I get a piece of media and I request it and it's focused on Latinx, because I don't know what that PR person is going to say, because ultimately they know what they have. So if I put in a request and I say, hey, I'm Kate Sanchez, editor-in-chief of But Why the Geek Community. We're really making sure to highlight Latinx content. We want to work with you. Here are my reviews of other Latinx things. That response will be, oh, great, that's awesome. This is the perfect person to do it. Or if they know what they have, they may be like, oh, well, she'll be a little critical of this because she is actually that. Maybe we don't give her that thing. And that's something that, like, I don't let it stop me, but I am very cognizant of. And then you have the other perspective, whereas anytime I tweet something, anytime I speak, if it's not positive, I'm automatically seen as being angry or worked up or emotional. And while that is a characteristic that gets attributed to a lot of women, Black and brown women experience that in a very different way, especially when engaging white women, both online and in person. And that's something that I've dealt with a lot, especially when having disagreements with other critics, or even when it came with this person's no longer on our staff, but working with somebody on our staff. And you have to consistently, how do I say it? Like, you're working harder, but you're not working harder in the places that you want to work harder at. I would love to work harder by reviewing more films, by, sending out more emails, but I'm putting in more labor trying to make sure that I am presentable to the people that hold the keys to the kingdom. And that's where things get really hard. And that's how the industry kind of impacts you, especially when you're a brown woman. When you can't pass for anything else. I have an anglicized name, but like, end of the day, my face comes up. You can, you know who I am. I don't hide it. It's very different. Like, it's a different experience that I don't think a lot of people understand. And a lot of the times it just gets left by the wayside, especially like with women in movements, like women in film, women in gaming. Where's the color? Are you all actually talking about us too? So yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
I really can talk all day. It's hard.
I'm glad you shared that, Kate, because I think a lot of people see what we do as kind of like low-hanging fruit, easy peasy. Like, yeah, you're out there and you're just like critiquing all the garbage because there's a bunch of garbage, and you're like, no, actually, we have to double think ourselves constantly. And, we want complexity, and we want to bring our critical brains into spaces that are Latinx created. And at the same time, just as you shared with me right now, there's a lot of kind of wrangling in our heads that we have to do precisely because of an industry that expects certain things from us. And one of the big things they expect from us is for us to be a kind of extension of their advertising wing, right?
Yep.
And we're not going to do that. And so, because like you said, we want better, we want more, we want to keep pushing, and we want to push our creatives to be able to step into those spaces, right? Oh my gosh, so much, Kate, that you and I like share in common on this. Of course, you get, you're there. Here's some really great sort of shots of, the red carpet, and you've already begun to share some of this experience. But as a Latina journalist, were there any, you've shared some of the challenges. There any big surprises for you, and other challenges that you wanted to share that we might not have touched on?
So I think to be positive here, my biggest surprise was how many people were willing to help. That blew me away. And it's different in different industries. And I'm only going to speak to film because gaming is a whole gatekeeping mess where people like to keep their contacts to themselves. But in film and in TV, I have had so many people understand my passion and offer to connect me with someone or offer to, give me that spot because they couldn't bring the same eye to the material. And very much I've been blown away by the ability of at least the people in the film circles that I run to understand how much identity plays into who gets what and wanting to correct that. There have been a few times where I've tweeted out about wanting to cover something and I have immediately had somebody jump into my DM and say, here's my contact, you can contact them or I can do an intro for you. And that warmed my heart because I think a lot of the issues that we have, and while, not all of them were Latinx, they're like the vast majority of them were other Latinx folks in the space who were like, I have this opportunity. You should also have this opportunity. There's something that happens, I think, for anybody from a marginalized group, where you can look at it as one of two ways. Like, I'm in this space and they're not letting many of us in this space. So I need to protect this space at all costs. And you become more insular and you become more competitive and you focus on that. And then there's the other side. And that's the side I fall in, where I say it all the time to like anybody I talk to, like they're like, oh, thank you for sharing your contact. I'm like, yeah, because a rising tide raises all boats. Like that's literally what happens. If more of us are in that room, we're all showing our worth to these companies and it opens the door for other people. And I very much believe, because in my full-time career, I'm a D&I professional, and working that and just my own experiences, I truly believe that if somebody can get in front of a door, that's the first thing. Because the problem with PR and the problem with, advancing in journalism is that you don't know where the hell that door is. And if you can just get in front of the right one, a lot of things can happen. And so I'm thankful for everybody who came in this space before me and who have reached out. And I'm doing my part to make sure that anytime I get an opportunity, I'm also contacting people who don't even write for my site, but like I know do good work and I think they should also be involved. And it's weird because like there is that hyper competitive idea, just because it is also like freelancing's hard. I don't freelance, so I don't kind of know that experience, but I know freelancing is hard when you're pitching and everything like that. But that's the surprise, like just how many people were open to helping.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the challenges that I didn't mention is realizing how many people only want to hear from us during Hispanic Heritage Month, or only want to hear from us when we're talking about Hentified and the Selena series.
Yeah.
But they don't want to hire us or do anything with us outside of that. And so that's been one of the weird things, is kind of like learning. It's this weird consciousness of your identity, whereas the importance that it brings, but at the same time, you're having to fight an industry that doesn't value that outside of certain periods. And so that's one of the things that like we've really tried to counteract on our site, because you shouldn't be forced to only write about your identity. Like, we should have people who are of the identity being represented writing about it, but that shouldn't be the only thing that you write about. Like, that shouldn't be what you're pigeonholed into. And so at our site, we make sure that the right people cover the right things, right, with the perspectives, but we also make sure that nobody ever feels like they have to write something about it. Like, we don't force people to write things that align to their identity. We encourage them to write things that drive them and give them passion and they love and they care for. And that is what I wish more outlets did, and what I know more outlets refuse to do. So that's another challenge, but thankfully I think the surprise that I said will help change that as we all start helping each other more.
So much wisdom and experience that you've just shared. Thank you, Kate. Tell me, you left the academy behind, and yet you are still very actively, taking on this role of teaching in a way, right? And disseminating knowledge. One of them, of course, is through podcasts. I know you do other things, but tell me about that. As how do you think of yourself not just as a pop culture critic, but also as a teacher?
So my main podcast, But Why Though, we have a really unique perspective, and all of us used to teach in some way or another. So obviously myself, I developed lesson plans. I taught in religious studies. I wanted to be a professor. My husband, who's also my co-host on there, he taught biology. And then our other co-host, Adrian, he taught high school, like he prepped high school students to go into college. So we all have a teacher's lens. So it means that like when we build out our show notes, we're focused, and it's kind of become like second nature, or I guess muscle memory. Everything is built to answer the question why, and preemptively tell people why they should care and learn. And that comes from a very pedagogical, like mind frame, like mindset. Like we very much focus on, you will leave this podcast with some sort of information. Now it's up to us to highlight which information is important and what conversations can have and be driven. And it's very different per podcast episode, because sometimes we just have a really fun thing and we just talk about Shonen Jump and all of the cool things that Shonen Jump has done and all the cool titles we want you to check out. And then on other podcasts, we did an episode on Picard, and I talked all about how Gene Roddenberry with The Next Generation and with Star Trek in general was very pivotal to having representation of lack of faith on screen in a way that we never really saw, and we still struggle to see today, where it was overt and it was there, but it was still respectful and understanding through a character like Picard and through like the way that Star Trek existed. And we take the time to find these little nuggets of education in the content that we're doing. And actually, if I think back there, we did an episode on Tony Hawk Pro Skater, the game series. And we talked about how Tony Hawk, how that game and that soundtrack is inherently, anti-cop because it's punk. And it is talking about like breaking the establishment. And we talked about how in the Tony Hawk character creation, it was one of the first times that we were able to pick characters who looked like us really in a more immersive way. And we talked about the importance of skin color variation in gaming creations, because giving us one color of brown to choose from leaves out so many people. And so for us, it's always about finding the pieces of information that don't just become a fun facts at like pop culture trivia, but can actually change how people see this media and see it as something that's bigger. And we do that through how we talk and focusing on the whys, but we also do it by ensuring that each host that leads an episode, they're leading an episode on something that they're a subject matter expert at. And it's funny when people hear us talk about our podcast, because we use like subject matter expert and we talk about it in a very different way, because it's one of those where like, if I'm going to talk about Selena, the guys don't care about Selena. Why would they lead the episode on Selena? But I do. And so I do my research. I present it from my fan lens. I present it from a pedagogical perspective. Like, this is why you should care. These are the things that she did in a historical perspective, even, because we look at how these pop culture either icons or franchises has impacted both the fan culture around it, and culture around it being like genre specific, right? So like, how did this person or thing impact the other things around it? Like, was it the first? Was it the best? That kind of stuff. And then we look at society. How did society interact with this, and what can we learn from it as like a response to it? And that's kind of like our basic setup. And it really has become teaching. And that's something that I really love. And it's one of the things that like a lot of our listeners have commented on, that like they learn something when they listen to us. And that is probably the best compliment I can get as a podcaster, especially for like the type of podcast I do. Because then on my anime podcast, we do that's a little bit different in that it is just on anime and manga. And our main goal with that is to share the perspective of women of color in this space. Because in anime and manga, there is a lot of anti-Blackness, and that anti-Blackness then leads to bigotry towards, brown women as well. And it's a space that, like, while we are there and we are moving it, like, Black women drive anime on Twitter. Like, that is a fact. Our voices are often not heard. Black and brown women's voices aren't heard in the space. And so we made our podcast to make sure that like that is our specific focus, race and ethnicity and our identities, and how that informs how we look at anime and manga and what the conversations that we want to have about that. And it's really interesting because our podcast started out just reviewing bad movies, like bad anime adaptations, and it's moved into talking about everything. And people laughed when my co-host and I said we were going to do a hentai episode, and they were like, "Oh, ha ha ha." We're like, "No, we want to have this conversation because Black and brown women are overtly sexualized in the outside world, but extremely have our sexualities extremely repressed in our families and in our communities and in our cultures, where we're told not to be these things, whether it's driven by like our mothers telling us the world is going to see you this way, so you must reject it at all costs, or are the religions around us that teach us that." And so for us, it was an important conversation to have around sex and sexuality in a media that we care for. And so yeah, those are kind of like the two angles that I see podcasting. Like, you can teach from yourself and just wanting to get your voice out there, and that it will teach people who are listening who may have never heard that perspective. And then on the other side, you can actually build out podcast content that has a goal of somebody has to take something away from this episode. I don't care what it is, but you're going to take something away from it. So.
Yeah, so great, Kate. And actually, where we really need this knowledge making and disseminating is in the university. We need you in those spaces, but fortunately, we have you in the podcast airwaves. Going back to some of the things that you talked about at the beginning, you mentioned, writing for Rotten Tomatoes and other spaces. It's interesting. You wrote this about We the Heroes, and while the film's theme is extremely upfront, it meets children where they are and aims to empower them. We Can Be Heroes is a heartfelt letter about the future that aims to be inspiring. This was going back to your kind of earlier comment about our struggle. I struggled with this one, and I've written books on Robert and his work, and this one was tough. Like, I don't know if I could have brought myself around to writing what you did, but that aside, we can talk about this movie, but we can also talk about writing for Rotten Tomatoes and why that's important as a Latina, and wherever you want to go with this.
Yeah. So I'll just touch on Rotten Tomatoes, but I'd love to dive into this movie because I love this movie in a very I recognize things don't hit with me, but I thought about it from little Kate's perspective, and little me would have dug this movie to a whole different extent. It's okay. But from the Rotten Tomatoes perspective, like one of the reasons that Rotten Tomatoes is really important is because a lot of films, there are a few different things that go into getting greenlit for another season or a sequel, and or being deemed a success. And part of that is critic responses, right? Money is one part, views is another part, and critic response is another thing. There are certain pieces of media that definitely are made with a specific person in mind. And that goes from like John Wick having like all of 15 minutes of dialogue and just being gratuitous violence outside of it, not really being made for people who don't like action movies, to something like trying to think like a Vida or Hentified, which they're speaking to a very specific experience, and that's who they're trying to reach. That's the target audience. The problem with Rotten Tomatoes on any sort of critic aggregator is when the people reviewing and the critics you're looking at aren't actually parts of that audience, you're missing out on the true value of the film. And that doesn't mean that they can't review it. They can, but you have to make sure that you're presenting a holistic sample size, right? Like you want to have Latinx critics in there. You want to have Black critics in there. You want to have, you know, people from marginalized genders. Like that is an important lens. And what you'll see a lot of when you go through Rotten Tomatoes scores, like pick any rom-com, go look at it, and there'll be a white dude who's probably in his 50s or 60s writing about how he hates rom-coms, and this movie is just about all the things he hates. That's not fair to the film. Like from a perspective of loving film, that's not fair to it. Or like there was a very specific John Wick movie review for John Wick 3, and there was an older woman, and she was like, I can't stand violence, and that's all this movie is. And I was like, well, did you see the other two? Maybe you shouldn't have been the one chosen to review this, because we all knew what we were getting. So that's why it's important to have varying perspectives on Rotten Tomatoes. And for me, it's why I try to make sure that I review everything that is that is a Latinx production, especially US born, because like that is a very important thing for me, because I can trace one side of my family to 9 generations in San Antonio. Like we've been here. I don't know Mexico from any other country. I know Texas and I know my Chicana and Tejana life. And that's a very important thing for me. And so like, I want to make sure that when we do get that media, because it's very few and far between, I can speak to it, and then I can actually impact it by putting a Rotten Tomatoes review up, and help it, you know, in certain ways. And I know that more people and studios are looking at those Rotten Tomatoes reviews than other reviews. So that's always my focus. But
so redeem We Can Be Heroes for me in a, I don't know, in a like,
well, I want to know what
elevator.
you didn't like about it.
Okay, I just felt like okay, so look, I love Spy Kids, and I didn't see Spy Kids when I was like, you know, a kid, obviously. My kid did, and she loved it. And you know, I love all of those movies that he was doing. There's some, you know, like Game Over, we can kind of like throw in the garbage can, right? But you know, all of his stuff is great. But for kids, that is. And I think it gets to this thing like you were talking about, where Robert has he's really good about clarity of kind of audience, like who he's imagining this movie appealing to, and his audience, and where he wants to take that audience. But I felt like this one was like the spread too thin. I want it to appeal to everybody, and then therefore not anybody. But you know, I will say I saw it once. I didn't go back to it, but my first reaction was kind of and because I didn't feel like it dialed in and did what Spy Kids did. I felt like it was throwing the net so far and so wide that it kind of lost that specificity and me as its audience person.
Yeah. No, I mean that's valid. I could see like certain elements of that because I think that there's the narrative and then the story and the theme in We Can Be Heroes is kind of twofold. Like, I think that this is something that like you can put on for your kid and your kid's gonna love, and you don't necessarily need to be there watching it. And from like the childhood perspective, so like I was a little bit older when I watched Spy Kids, but my little brother was a kid. And it was important for him because he saw a blended family. Because my brother's dad, it's always weird saying that because I have to provide context because I just call him dad. But he's mixed. And so my brother is also mixed. And for him, it was important to see that like that two sides of you is still okay. And that is, you're still, you know, your parents' kid and you're still connected to your identity in a way. And that was something he took away that I don't even know if Robert meant, but like it is what he took away watching it. But with We Can Be Heroes, I think that this was a movie that was necessary because we stand at a really interesting point. I do agree that there are notes in this that are definitely for like the parent and definitely for the older person. But I don't think it's as vast. I think the only part that is for the parent is the takeaway lesson that you need to be ready to just give this up to your kid because your kid is going to come in and your kid's going to have to solve the problem. Your kid is going to have to do this on their own. And this isn't just in a micro sense. Like, this isn't just like you can't pay your kids' bills forever. Like, we're in a crisis in history where it is not the adults who are going to fix it. No matter how much people try to tell me, Biden's not going to fix our climate. Who is going to fix the climate are the Gen Zers who have come up and are still coming up, and the people after them who are going to have to live with all these ramifications and have to solve it themselves because there's nothing in place for them to fix this. They have to build the system to fix it. They have to enact the system to fix it. And they have to hope that we can survive long enough for them to be able to do those things. And I think that this also comes because I just screened the Greta Thunberg documentary where she very clearly lays this out, that this is in her generation's hands. And so I think that affected me going into We Can Be Heroes, but that was what I took away from it. Because
hey man, I'll take it for sure, Kate. And I love your take on it too. You know, I mean, it goes back to that thing that you and I talked about. You know, we want to be there to elevate and amplify. We also want to be critical and smart about it. But I'll watch it again. Let's have another conversation on this.
I will say the costuming is horrible, which I say in my review. The costuming is so bad.
Yeah. Well, part 2, We Can Be Heroes, will be our next our next session. Where is the vitality? I mean, you have your brain in so many, and your heart in so many different places with Latinx pop culture. What is really exciting to you?
Oh, this is a hard one because it's all exciting, but I think it's more about the individual. One of the things that really inspires me for the future is how many Latinx folks are standing up and taking it into their own hands. Okay, you're not going to let me write for you. I'm just going to start my own blog and I'm going to write and I'm going to make my YouTube channel and we're going to keep going. Like, in a way, content creation in and of itself has created a space where like it's kind of cannibalizing itself at some points. Like, there's too much going on and you have to fight to get seen. But the other side to that is that everybody has a microphone now and everybody can contribute to the conversation. And what we need to do, people in my position, people in positions where they can elevate others, is seek out those Latinx podcasts, seek out those Latinx reviewers and retweet their stuff. Tell people to go follow them. Put in the work to highlight the other people who are doing the work and not being seen because you have some visibility. And because that's like, there's such a beautiful culture erupting of like, we're tired of not being seen. We're going to make you see us. And that's happening in podcasts, that's happening with YouTube, and that's especially happening on Twitch. Like, I am seeing more and more Latinx creators on Twitch who are producing content in English and Spanish, who are producing year-round content that isn't focused on their identity, but they're just chilling and playing Monster Hunter. Like, there is so much of a focus coming in that is saying, listen to our voices here because it matters, but also listen to my voice when I'm just talking about something that you may not see as aligned to me. We're focusing on everything at once, and that is refreshing to have and see. And it may be hard for people to get eyes on us, but like, we're here and we're trying to make as many waves as we can. And like, that tenacity, like, I am a tenacious person, and I mean that in the most positive way. And I think that is deeply built into who I am because of my Mexican heritage and because of my mother, who taught me to be that way. And I would say in the last few years, seeing the content creator explosion of Latinx folks, like, it gives me hope that people will finally start hiring us, that people will finally start giving us those set spots. And you know what? If that doesn't happen, we'll create our own space. We'll create our own outlets. We'll create our own work. And we're going to be so big that you're just going to have to see us.
I love that. We are not waiting around. We've never been waiting around, but I think you're right. Technology has allowed us to really start. We're flying right now, making waves, tenacity, a journey shared with Kate Sanchez of really living kind of epistemology, right? And learning through a pop cultural, creative, critical mind that is Kate Sanchez. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. This is a lot of fun.